Is Gemini 3 for me? In the last 24 hours, Google released Gemini 3 Pro, and for me, it genuinely marks a new chapter in the race to true artificial intelligence. Not only because Google is now clearly ahead, but also because it will be pretty hard for other companies to match their rate of acceleration. I have tested Gemini 3 hundreds of times, including through early access, and it is indeed a significant leap, not just a nudge forwards. On my own private independent benchmark, Simple Bench, it crushed its rivals, or I should say beat its own record to be clearly number one in this benchmark. I will show you a sample question in a moment, but you may think that's a fluke. Well, that would be a pretty hard line to maintain with the 20 other benchmarks in which it reaches record performance. So, while Gemini 3 is not perfect, it will be a deafening wake-up call to companies like OpenAI and Anthropic. I'm also going to touch on benchmarks where it didn't perform as well as the fascinating new tool, Google Anti-Gravity. Above all, I'm going to try and give you at least 11 details that you wouldn't get from just reading the headlines that are going viral about the new Gemini 3. Let's start with the benchmark with the scariest name, Humanity's Last Exam. And the reason the author of that benchmark, whom I've spoken to, called it that was because he solicited the hardest possible questions that he could derive using any expert out there. They paid for any question at the time, which is around a year ago, that the frontier models couldn't get right. Now, the name of that benchmark has become somewhat ironic because even without doing a web search, just using its own knowledge, so no tools, Gemini 3 Pro gets 37.5%. A huge leap above GPT 5.1, and that's a theme that you'll see recurring throughout these benchmarks. And sticking with knowledge for a second, what about scientific knowledge in STEM subjects? That's tested in the Google Proof Q and AGPQA Diamond. Even the creator of this benchmark thought that model performance had plateaued. But no, Gemini 3 Pro sets a record 92% almost. That compares to GPC 5.1 getting 88.1%. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. Oh, well, that's only 4% improvement. Don't go too wild. But imagine that 5% of that benchmark is noise, as in there's no real correct answer for those 5% of questions. That puts the ceiling at 95%. So just that delta from 88% to 92% represents eliminating over half of the remaining genuine errors that a model makes on that benchmark. Average PhD performance from experts in those respective domains was around 60%. Now, well, that's just knowledge, though. What about fluid intelligence, true reasoning without memorization? That is why Francois came up with ARKAGI1, and then when that was saturated, ARKAGI2. These are visual reasoning puzzles that are not found in the training data of these models verified independently by the ARK prize. If LLMs were just memorizing, performance should be abysmal. But Gemini 3 Pro almost doubles the performance of GPT 5.1. Fine. But what about more familiar reasoning, like incredibly complex and difficult mathematical questions? That is what the authors of Math Arena Apex did when crafting that benchmark. They said, quote, "We are collecting the hardest problems from many recent competitions and aggregating them into a single benchmark. Gemini 3 Pro 23.4%, 4%. Analyzing tables and charts, Gemini 3 Pro has got you covered with record-setting performance in a handful of benchmarks that test that. Analyzing video record performance in the video MMU. And even after telling you about that benchmark, we are less than halfway through the record-setting performances that Gemini 3 Pro achieved. Which is why I'm going to have to take a quick interlude to just give you a hint about how they did this. They didn't just throw in an extra few thousand questions into the reinforcement learning pipeline, eke out a victory in a couple of game benchmarks and call it a day. No, they massively scaled up pre-training. The number of parameters that go into a model, some estimate around 10 trillion parameters, not all of which are active at one time, but they would have also scaled up the training data, So that same dial that moved us from the original check GPT 3.5 to GPT-4, which caused a sensation 2.5 years ago, was moved yet another big increment forwards. For me, this is Google demonstrating its hardware and infrastructure dominance. Google trained Gemini 3 on their own in-house TPUs, not NVIDIA's GPUs. And maybe they're the only company that can afford to serve a model of this size at this scale, and with pretty reasonable prices via the API too. This is why many people believe, me included, that Google has now taken the lead in AI and may not surrender that lead for a very long time. So, what does ramping up pre-training really do? That is the real question.